Social relations looks at how we relate to one another. So, components of social relations could be prejudice, aggression, conflict, physical attraction and love, altruism and peacekeeping. Each of these elements are how we interact with one another, how we relate to one another, how we treat one another. So let's talk about prejudice. Now, prejudice is uh, an unjustifiable belief, emotion, or behavior towards a group and its members. Now, prejudice is oftentimes negative, but there are non-negative prejudices as well. So if I were to ask you, what is your favorite ice cream? Well, that your preference would mean you're prejudiced against the other ice cream, right? But that's not a negative connotation. But what we're talking about is with people. We have our biases, right? Prejudice reflects biases. And within prejudice, we look at stereotyping and discrimination. Stereotyping is an overly generalized belief about a group and its members. Now, the reality is, if we were to look at stereotypes, the vast majority of stereotypes are used to put down a group. And even stereotypes that seem positive can be used negatively. Can you think of some stereotypes? And I'm inviting it. I do not necessarily believe you adhere to this stereotype. But if I were to ask you a stereotype about white people, what is a stereotype about white people? Promise I won't be offended.
They don't use seasonings when they cook, except salt and pepper.
Their food is fairly bland, when in reality, you know, that might be the case in some people, but not all white people have bland food. And obviously, whiteness is a social construct in its own right. You know, there are others like uh, they can't dance or they can't jump. Remember the movie White Men Can't Jump? Well, that was a stereotype, but in reality, we know through the slam dunk contest that that's not true, right? So it doesn't apply to every white person. And Brent Barry dunked from the free throw line, which at that point in time, only Michael Jordan and Julius Erving did. So, and he was white, right? So obviously, you know, what we say could be overly generalized. And notice how it's like, oh, you can't do something. There's an implication that you don't belong doing that. Are there any stereotypes about African Americans?
All the tall ones play basketball.
All the tall ones play basketball. Um, okay, and again, once again, that is, if you look at the influence of the European League, Australian leagues, and Chinese basketball leagues, you see that that isn't the case. Now, we put people into boxes based on exposure, but that isn't, you know, that isn't even logical when you think about how many tall African Americans there are and how many are actually in the NBA, right? So it doesn't even make sense from a logic point of view, but that's a stereotype. How about Asians?
They're good at math.
They're good at math. So here you're like, hey, this seems like a positive thing. It's called the model minority stereotype. So Asians are suggested to be good at mathematics. They're suggested to be successful in general, and it puts pressure. What do you do if you are Asian and you're not good at math, right? Think about that for a second. What does that do to your psychological well-being? And how is that stereotype used for other ethnic minorities? Well, if Asians are successful and they're good at math, the reason why you're not successful is you're not working hard enough. So be careful with the application of even positive stereotypes because they get applied to other groups negatively. So stereotypes in general are beliefs about a group. Then we have discrimination, which are behaviors or actions you take towards a group, right? So the lack of inclusivity of a group and its members because of a stereotype or general prejudice. So what are some of the social and emotional factors that lead to prejudice? So we have social inequality, right? So we have one explanation for social inequality. The people have money, power, and prestige uh, justify having these things and say, hey, I've earned this, right? And things should stay as they are. And the reason why you don't have it is it's your own fault. So there's victim blaming, where if a person doesn't have money, power, prestige, it's your own fault, right? So you are responsible for your misfortune. You are responsible for the harm that comes to you. So that is more of a social mindset. There's also the idea of an in-group versus an out-group. An in-group refers to people who are similar to one another. So it's easy to apply the principle of us versus them. So in an in-group, that's the us. So we have an in-group preference, right? So we're going to provide favors and do preferential treatment of members of our own group. Well, that leads to prejudice. And how about the other, the out group, the them? They're perceived differently than the in group. And because they're different, unlike the in group, which we treat favorably, we treat the out group wrong. So whenever we other a person or a community, we're justifying prejudice towards that group. Now, scapegoating bias is to look for an outlet of a person or a group to be at fault. So if we were to look at scapegoating theory and the Jewish people, right? So there is this myth that the Jewish people control the banks, which is not true. But so if there's a financial crisis, in many places, even in history, Jews were blamed and oftentimes killed for that. So now the word scapegoat actually comes from the Bible. Remember the story where you pick two goats and one is considered to live. The other one is called the scapegoat. When we're seeking atonement back in the day, they confessed all the sins of the nation on this goat and they pushed it off a cliff. Now, this goat did nothing but be selected as the scapegoat. So therefore, it was, it assumed all the blame and all the transgressions of the nation. So that's in the Bible. But we apply it to people and groups of people in a harmful way. Now, what about the cognitive roots of prejudice? So we put people into boxes. A cognitive root is categorization. So Daniel Kahneman talks about the principle of heuristics. And in general, the reason why we categorize and organize is so that we can be more efficient in functioning in our world. But the problem is that when we try to put people into boxes, we oftentimes they don't fit in the boxes we put them in. So even if there might be an element of truth, the stereotypes alter or bias our perceptions, and we treat people differently. After 9/11, we have another one, right? So vivid cases. If you were to think of 9/11, there was a significant uptick in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred and violence. And you might say, well, why was there this Islamophobia? Why was there this hatred of Muslims? And the answer is the concept of vivid cases. A vivid case is something that we see, it sticks in our mind, and we have strong memories. So, because the hijackers of the planes happen to be Muslim, the mindset towards all Muslims were treated as Muslim equals terrorist or Islam equals terrorism. And that's a problem because the vast majority of Muslims have nothing to do with terrorism, right? There are 1.4 billion Muslims in the world. And in reality, the average Muslim has no connection to terrorism whatsoever, but doesn't stop bigots or people with biases to treat Muslims wrongly or to treat Muslims with harm, right? So if you were to look at the 1.4 billion Muslims, over 96% have nothing to do with terrorism. So the average Muslim that you walk down the street and see, they're not connected to any form of violence or terrorism. But people will target Muslims based on this vivid case. So that experience of 9/11 sticks and creates these strong memories and strong emotions, and it's overgeneralized. Now, another cognitive root of prejudice is the belief that the world is just. So the just world phenomenon suggests that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So the world is fair, the world is just, and if something is happening to you, somehow you deserve it, right? That's a cognitive root of prejudice. And this is a tough discussion to have, right? But it's an important one because we all have biases. We all have our preconceived notions about individuals, groups, and communities. And we have to check them. We have to evaluate what we might be over applying to a group in its or community. So that's prejudice. I'm going to skip the implicit association test, and I'll be able to get through aggression, and that's where I'll stop.